on Zoom here. Good morning from the West Coast, from CPPS. Good morning or good afternoon to the East Coast. Apparently I need another cup of coffee, but hello from CPPS, everybody. Great to be with you all. Today we're going to be discussing workplace violence prevention and intervention for the healthcare industry and how to build a program for that industry and really take a look at how we're building programs to protect our folks. And I'm Jake Newton. I'm the Vice President of Security Solutions for the company. And I'm joined by Dave Benson, one of our senior subject matter experts. And I've got Randy Spivey, who's our CEO. And for about the next 45, 50 minutes here, we're going to just talk about some different things that we've been noticing in the industry. There's been some updates and trends that have been occurring that we want to just discuss with you, our clients and friends in the industry. But really, we also want to talk about, just given everything that's going on, how to really build a program that is comprehensive for the healthcare space. And so just briefly to give you kind of an overview of what we'll be chatting about, and we'll be talking about some of those trends that we're noticing lately. In January, we had the Joint Commission come out with some updated standards. So we want to talk about those. We'll also give some notable mentions to the DNV side of things as well. And then we want to talk about how all of this applies. Some of you might be familiar with our tiered approach for workplace violence prevention and how we really align an organization with standards and best practices that are out there. But given all of these adjustments in the industry, we want to share what that looks like, given some of these updates to the industry that we've seen. And then, of course, there's been some things that we've had coming up to date now with talking about the threat management team eLearning, that if you joined in here live, you get a potential drawing into. So we'll share the details about those kinds of things at the end. But some of the administrative pieces for this, of course, you probably all attended a webinar by now, I'm sure. But if you have any questions, feel free to send those into the Q&A space. I'll do my best to monitor chat, but I'm going to try to emphasize the Q&A space over there. And then we'll probably trickle some of those in from questions we've seen just up to date, up until, in preparation for this webinar here as well, just to make sure that we provide you that information that you'll really find valuable and hopefully be able to take away and implement in your day-to-day. So with that, I will pass it over to Randy to get us rolling here and just kind of talk about some of the trends we're seeing and kind of lay a foundation for some of these different things that are occurring lately in the industry, and launch with getting into some of the content from there. Randy.
Okay, well, thank you, Jake, and welcome everyone from wherever you're at and whatever time zone. It is a pleasure to spend a few minutes with you talking about some of the crazy things that continue to happen around our country. I was in Washington, D.C. Last week talking with members of Congress about the recent shootings that have been happening, with most notably the horrible tragedy down in Texas at the school shooting. But it's not just isolated, obviously, to that school shooting. We're seeing just in the last, couple of weeks, well over 20, 25 what would be classified as mass shootings. Not always mass casualties as far as number of dead, but as far as the number of shootings, it's just continuing to really increase. And one of the things that I think, I put out a post on LinkedIn a few days ago where I said this shooting that happened down in Texas, I believe is a bit of a tipping point, because we've been doing this now since 2007, right after the Virginia Tech shooting. Is when we started putting out content on how to train people to be able to respond in an extreme violence event like an active shooter. And at the time, there was no guidance out there. And so we really were kind of the trailblazers in that area. And I've seen it go from creating content on how to survive an active shooter situation to an initial pushback, and people don't want to talk about that, to now just this overwhelming resonance of outcry, really on a national level, of what are we going to do? After another shooting, in fact, in the last, before the school shooting, there was 10 people killed in a grocery store from Buffalo, New York. a couple of people shot and killed at a flea market down in Houston, Texas, a church shooting in Southern California, and then the school shooting where you saw 21 people shot and killed. Yeah, that's all within a fairly compressed period of time. And the law enforcement argument and law enforcement response just pushed aside. I think that there is a increased cry that's coming out from parents, it's coming out from just everybody on how are we going to stop these from happening, and how do we prepare people to deal with it. And that's really, what we're focused on. We're going to talk about it for the healthcare specific industry, and we'll talk about some of the legislation that's going through Congress right now, related specifically to healthcare. But more than that, I'm just seeing a level of exasperation amongst everybody on what do we do about this. And we saw after Sandy Hook, the immediate response is kind of similar to the immediate response here, where a lot of discussions about gun control and how are we going to control guns, or how are we going to proliferate guns, and there really wasn't a lot of change policy-wise. But I think there might be an opportunity, especially with just some initial conversations that I've seen around the DC area, to try and move the needle a little bit, hopefully more than just a little bit. Whether it's hardening the schools, but one of the things in the conversations that I had, and I'm all for increasing hardening the schools, but as far as making them a hard target. But what happens when the kids go to a shopping mall after they leave the school? We can spend $500 billion on hardening the schools, but what are we going to do? What do they take with them once they go to church? Or what do they go to the shopping mall, or they go to wherever it is when they leave the school? Because we're seeing the shootings happening everywhere. So one of the things that we really focus on here at CPPS is how do you harden mindsets? How do you educate people to be able to become an immediate responder through the training and education that they get on how to prevent and respond to these kind of incidents, regardless of where they happen. And if they happen in a healthcare setting, okay, here's a set of protocols. If they happen in a school, here's a set of protocols. And if they happen at a movie theater, here's a set of protocols. And they have all a similar theme. So, the healthcare industry certainly has a unique set of risks, and requirements when it comes to, not just protecting yourself, but protecting the patient and responding, as a survivor protector. But I think what we really need to do, and I was doing a presentation for InfraGard chapter not too long ago, and a guy in the audience said, after I got done presenting, says, "Randy, it sounds to me like you're saying what we really need to do is train our kids on reading, writing, arithmetic, and personal protection." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I am. I think that's wise in this world environment that, we are educating everybody. And by doing that, you begin to harden their mindsets, not just the facilities that they're sitting in. And they take that with them wherever they go." So that's the theme that you'll hear from us, regardless of what environment that it is. But today we're going to talk about healthcare. So Jake, I'll turn it back to you and Dave to kind of walk us through some of the latest trends specifically to healthcare. But I just want to set the stage that, when we talk about setting up a holistic program, the objective is to build resiliency. Resiliency in the individual, resiliency in the facilities, and within the organizations. And then the more we do that, the holistic environment becomes a hard target, not just a building.
Yeah, and Randy, before we even get into some of these trends, I want to dive in just a little bit to a nugget that you mentioned, just about the survivor protector mindset, because with that's a big difference with the healthcare space compared to some other industries that we work with, and with the increased duty of care issues and everything else, you've got the the healthcare providers having to take care of the patients, or and then you've got the various locations that they are working, whether it's home health care or in the hospital. Can both of you guys kind of break down the survivor protector the mindset a little bit, and talk about how that's kind of a unique challenge for violence prevention in the healthcare space?
Yeah, Dave, why don't you start with that, and then I'll follow on.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to see you all again. When we talk about at the center of this concept of survivor protector, and I remember so well, Randy, when you and I and others were conceptualizing this a long time ago now, when we came out with our first suite of training for healthcare, folks in the healthcare industry don't have the luxury of just worrying about themselves. And so they have themselves as individual employees, they have their teams that they work with, they have patients, and they also have family members of those patients. And because of the very nature of the healthcare industry, almost always it's open to the public in some way, shape, or form. So when we talk about response strategies for extreme violence, we have to keep that in mind. And so you just can't run and leave your patients. You just can't worry about your staff and not pay attention to visitors. So all these things have led us to this concept of survivor protector. And so you may have to make some different arrangements based upon where you are, who you are, and what your circumstances is. And that's just one of many reasons why the healthcare industry is unique in this section.
Yeah, and it's kind of similar to an education environment, especially K through 6. The teachers, administrators aren't just survivors; they're survivor protectors. They have a responsibility to the students as well as themselves. And like you said, Dave, it's not just for the staff at the hospital, but we have those who are caretakers for. So it's a broader dynamic, and it can be a little more complicated, on where that line is between what you got to do for yourself in conjunction with those that you're taking care of. So we flesh that out in the training, so to help give people some ideas and considerations to go through on how to respond in that environment.
Thanks, guys. That's just a question that we often get when we're talking to some of the different organizations that we work with, and it's kind of a good launch pad into the broader topic that we're going to be discussing in this webinar. And it also, I think, kind of gets into why the healthcare industry, over these past several months, is getting that added emphasis to include this legislation we're seeing go through the Senate now. It's already passed in the House, HR 1195, I think it's called, where it's going to dictate that OSHA creates a standard requiring healthcare organizations to, meet certain standards within their violence prevention programs. And so that's kind of one of the other things that'll kind of launch us in, and I'll talk about the different standards that we typically benchmark in a minute. But the question to you guys is why are we seeing some of these advancements in this space, and kind of what are some of those trends that these advancements that the Joint Commission has done, and why now? Why in the Senate and these different things to advance the space now?
I'll take a shot at that, Randy. First and foremost, for those of you that are on this webinar, know that incidents of violence in the healthcare industry, this is nothing new per se. So what is new is the intensity, how it's been exacerbated by certain environmental conditions. I mean, for example, it was recently revealed that healthcare and social service workers are at least 5 times more likely to experience workplace violence more than any other workers. I think the number 2 is still the retail industry, but it's far and away comprising 73% of non-fatal workplace injuries and illnesses. And so there's a couple of pieces to that. If you can't work, you're not at work, you're losing time at work. But if you're more seriously injured, it can have long-ranging consequences. And that exposure to violence in the workplace at all different levels. And if you know anything about us at the center, our goal is prevention whenever possible. Yeah, we want to help you respond to an act of extreme violence if that happens, but we just as soon it not happen at all. It impairs your mission, effective patient care. And in fact, Randy, I would argue that the rates, the current statistics are probably a little skewed because I think they're probably much higher. They're not being reported to the degree that they need to be. And I think that's another reason why these organizations are taking a real hard and fast look at that. Not to mention things like psychological distress, job dissatisfaction, absenteeism, high turnovers and higher costs, we are just coming through, at least we hope so, the tail end of a unprecedented pandemic. And believe me when I tell you, based upon our research, the healthcare industry has really had its share of burdens, not just because they're treating the sick, not just because they don't necessarily traditionally have had the bed space, which causes stress, but also, for lack of a better term, the hemorrhaging of workers, of healthcare workers that may or may not come back. And so when you look at all of these things, it's no wonder that organizations like the Joint Commission and OSHA are really taking a deeper dive on this and coming up with very specific standards.
You know, and
Anything to add to that?
yeah, one of the things I think you're going to see happen, just based on some of the interaction that we're starting to see already in DC, is I think this will kind of be leading legislation for the areas that are highest risk. But I think it won't be that long, and you're going to see a national legislation requiring workplace violence standards, training, policies, threat assessment protocols that are already, individual acts and legislation that's pushing its way through. But I think you're going to see a holistic one that's going to happen here sometime in the next few years. So I think this is kind of the start, but and already OSHA considers having the programs in place part of the duty of care, and you can be sued if you don't have a program in place right now. It's just going to get more and more oversight, more and more requirements, particularly as we continue to see society just really struggling and violence increasing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is actually a really good segue into, if I can get onto the screen here, some of these prevailing benchmarks that we've seen over the years as really guiding the healthcare space and at large the violence prevention program development overall. And when we're building programs for organizations, there's traditionally two prevailing documents that we've really seen, and then the two on the right hand side I'll dive into specifically for healthcare. But back in 2011, you had OSHA as well as ASIS International, the largest security association in the world, publish their initial guidance for developing a workplace violence prevention and intervention program. So ASIS put an American national standard out, and then OSHA, I think not coincidentally at the same time, put out a field instruction that really laid out when somebody has a case of workplace violence, or there's a report or a complaint and they're coming on site, it lays the foundation for what those investigators are going to be looking at and throughout their investigation process. And so traditionally what we have done is kind of put together an approach that really synthesizes that guidance and lays the foundation for what a program really needs to look like. And what we've really seen is the ANSI standard, the one on the far left published by ASIS, tends to be one of the most detailed we see. And so we often recommend that as one of those benchmarks for a program because it does take such a deep dive in what a program really needs to include. Well, now that we're getting some of these advancements and progressions in the actual industry, now we've got the new Joint Commission standards, and there's also a document published in 2015 by OSHA that talks about what does a violence prevention program development process look like specifically for healthcare and social service workers. And so just briefly, I want to address some of the new standards that we're seeing that the Joint Commission published, but also talk a little bit about the DNV because there are some differences, but there's also some similarities. And then what we'll really talk about for the next several minutes when I pass it back to Dave and Randy is what does this program development process look like? And so ultimately, like I said, the two documents on the left-hand side are what we've seen kind of regardless of industry. Those are popping up in civil litigation and different things like that. But then we had the Joint Commission publish their new standards in January. So some of these things say, you need to build a program and have a written process, and then some of them are more robust. And that also really speaks to the Joint Commission lately. So for example, they say now that you need to have an annual analysis of the overall program. What they really want to see is tracking of incidents, reporting of incidents, and being able to have that information be consolidated and reviewed on an annual basis so that a hospital can really understand its risk to violence that has happened and for potential violence in the future. One of the things that we know is, while maybe the emergency room gets the emphasis sometimes, that's not the only place it can happen. So as organizations, we need to really look at this process as an institution wide consideration. So some other things that we saw in there is there's the multidisciplinary oversight of this program. The Joint Commission has one of its newer standards saying that we want to have a program champion, for lack of better terms, somebody that's going to actually manage the program, but have a multidisciplinary process to really manage the program and oversee the process and respond to incidents, those sorts of things. And we'll talk about a multidisciplinary threat management team that's a growing capability in the healthcare industry, but also a really robust playbook, if you will, for prevention of violence in the workplace. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then one of the other big ones that we saw for this space as well is now the added emphasis on training and what really goes into that. So the Joint Commission says that we need to have training on an annual basis, but also when things change, like position change, and it needs to have certain things in place. And so we'll talk about those. But when we talk about some of these other documents, we can even take that one step further, where like the ANSI standard, for example, says we also need to train management. We need to train a multidisciplinary threat management team. And so all of these different things we are addressing within this tiered approach. And what we're trying to do for you is give you a visual snapshot of what this really looks like. The last thing I say before we actually get into this tiered approach is that document cover, the picture I have on the far left-hand side there, this OSHA document also goes into a couple of these different considerations in terms of how to build this fuller program. And what OSHA really does is breaks it down into two stovepipes, I guess is what I call them. They've got the administrative controls, and they've got what they call the engineering controls. So the engineering controls would be a lot of the physical security things, if you will. And then the administrative controls gets into the policies, having a written policy, the various procedures for incident management and those sorts of things. And so these four documents together are your benchmark for building a strong violence prevention program for healthcare. And it's one of the things that we benchmark when we're working with clients. The other side of this is industry best practice. So just one example of that we're seeing is there's a lot of healthcare organizations that are starting to hire and dedicate a workplace violence prevention program manager, or have somebody that's actually kind of dedicated to that role. So there's things like that we're seeing that are emerging best practices as well. So just to give everybody a feel of what this looks like for the tiered approach, you might be familiar with this, but this is what we really want to dive into for the larger components of this discussion, so that you can really have a feel, what does this process look like to be able to align my program with these different requirements, but also have something that is not overwhelming to implement as well. So Dave, I want to pass it over to you. That first tier is plans, policies, and procedures. What is that really getting at, and what are the core areas of beginning to build that program for tier one?
Yeah, so thank you, Jake. So I think it's important to highlight that it's not like these organizations woke up one morning and said, wow, we've done virtually nothing with workplace violence prevention and we better get on the ball. That's not true. To a large degree, as you go, and we encourage you all to go through the Joint Commission documents and the OSHA directive, it talks a great deal of adding on addendums to, enhancing what already exists. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we go through. But when we're talking about a tier one, from a healthcare perspective, they want an annual assessment. And there's a real emphasis here on everybody that's responsible for that within the organization be a part of that, building that. In addition, there will be there's an absolute requirement that every 5 years you kind of have a third party or an outside look at the work you've done, so that it's a living document, living program. You're going to continue to move forward in that regard. unlike other industries, the healthcare industry pays attention to things like, injuries to patients, occupational illness, damage to property and property of others, and then safety and security incidents, and trying to knock down some of those barriers. So that's an occupational safety piece. This is more of a security concern. This is something that should be forwarded to folks that are managing threats for the organization. They're kind of putting it all under one umbrella, which we at the center is a really, really good thing. The other thing in the healthcare industry, it's really dependent on analytics. And so there's a real specific emphasis in these documents, particularly the Joint Commission, on having good, accurate analytics, that they're up to date, and you can use them to benchmark your existing programs on what you need to do and what not to do. And then there's this comment of an element of performance. So how are you doing? And this is something we try to stress with all of our clients at the center, but it's not a one and done. You don't put together your program and say, oh, this is awesome. Thank you, CPPS, if they work with us, or whatever, however it works. You need to keep analyzing it. What works, what doesn't work, what are some of the changes in the industry? And so that's some of the big language there that we're talking about. And of course, policies, plans, and procedures specific to workplace violence. Okay, and so tying in your other safety policies, your medical protocols, all those things that are inherent in a healthcare system, but they must have some relevance as well to violence prevention within the organization.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. So as you build upon, building those policies and plans for the program, that really lays that foundation. Then from there, we have all of this training that really supports the policies and that commitment to a safe environment free from violence and threats of violence, those sorts of things. And what we've said, many times before, and it absolutely still applies to the healthcare industry, is, this is an informational process. You have to really have that solid foundation, and all of this be included throughout the training, so it's consistent all the way up, so that if somebody does make a threat, for example, that information can get where it needs to go, so that we can, go through the incident management process or do those things to, prevent the violence to the extent that we're able. And, the training is such a critical piece of that. So, Randy, for those next couple of tiers, that, the awareness training, the training for managers and supervisors, what really goes into that process?
Yeah, well, it's based on the principle that I was talking about earlier. Our objective here is to build resiliency in preventing violence from happening, and then how to respond effectively if it does. And so that's based on awareness. And so one of the things that is really important is that when we start talking about awareness training, this tier 2, it's for all the employees, or it's for all the volunteers. Or if you have contractors, it's for everybody that's in the environment, because you're only good as your weakest link. And so, when we were doing high risk training in the military, so one of the pieces of research that we knew is that about 10% of people in a crisis are going to be able to respond effectively if they've had no training. About 10% of people in a crisis with training are going to mess it up. But it's that 80% in the middle that you really begin to normalize the response and build effective response as an organization by making sure everybody's on the same sheet of music. And so when we talk about awareness training, it outlines in that standard 5 basic areas for awareness training that everybody needs to be educated on. What is workplace violence? What is it? What is it not? It's much more than just a workplace shooting. So it talks about that, and Dave highlighted that a little bit a moment ago. Number 2, well, what are the warning signs that somebody may be progressing towards violence? Because it's a myth that people just snap. We're seeing that. This guy down in Texas, the school shooting, it looks like he didn't have just red flags. He had neon lights. There were opportunities to possibly intervene. So what are those red flags? And then once they see it, the third area is an employee sees one of these red flags. Who do they let somebody know? Who do they report it to? what is the organizational structure on reporting mechanisms so that people can then respond effectively. And then the fourth area is, and particularly, I think, highlighted in the healthcare environment, is the issue of intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And because so many times when you see extreme violence blow up in a workplace, it's coming out of a bad relationship at home. Number 5 is the extreme violence. How do you respond in a crisis? An active shooter, a bomb, somebody coming in with a knife, whatever the threat may be, how do people move past fear and be able to respond effectively? So those are the 5 things that will be incorporated in your awareness training. The third level, or the tier 3, will be for the managers, leaders, supervisors, and that's going to take and build on the tier 2 as far as what are the warning signs. We call it threat awareness. And then how do they respond effectively to de-escalate a tense situation? Somebody, but this isn't just in healthcare. Everybody seems like they're stressed out and have a short fuse, but it is especially amplified in the healthcare environment. And so how do you de-escalate effectively to try and prevent somebody from crossing that line to, verbally acting out to becoming violent? We don't want to see it get there. And then if somebody is making threats, then you have an awareness enough that I need to push this up to the next level, what we call the tier 4, the threat assessment team, that Dave is very familiar with. So, and honestly, both the tier 2 and tier 3 often is missing in healthcare environments, or there might be a little bit of policies and there may be something that was mentioned on the onboarding process, but, being able to really walk an employee through the what is awareness, and then particularly the managers and supervisors and leaders on how do I effectively de-escalate and do that and have practiced that. It's usually not there. And you don't have to spend hours on this. You can do an effective program in 30 minutes for each of those tiers, particularly if it's refreshed. These are perishable skills. So it's not like, okay, I did it 2 years ago or 4 years ago and I'm good to go. It does, for lack of a better term, you need a booster shot on this type of refresher training. So those are the, awareness training, and tier 3 being the manager and leader training. And then the tier 4, I'll let Dave go through, that'd be the threat assessment training.
Thank you, Randy. And just a couple of maybe cherries on the sundae there and your really excellent overview. Unlike other disciplines, when we talk about de-escalation in a healthcare environment, many of the stakeholders not only have an opportunity, they have a mandate to intervene. And so it's kind of de-escalation and then some. And so that is certainly highlighted on that. And then the other thing that's really important about that is that the Joint Commission really emphasizes that this training, they call, we always talk about initial and then recurring. Well, they go a little farther. They talk about when you first come on board as part of the onboarding process. So that bespeaks orientation, whatever that might be. So, we think that's excellent. And so it really is kind of a 3-legged stool when you think about that. You first come on board, maybe an expanded view as a leader, and then the recurring stuff as you move on. So when we start talking about threat management in healthcare, like everything in the healthcare industry, it's complicated. It's not better or worse, it's just different. And so having done a lot of work with the healthcare industry in the area of threat assessment and threat management and managing the real-time threat assessment program for CPPS, there's some things we want to keep in mind. So first of all, it's not suggested, it's strongly recommended that threat assessment be part of a violence prevention program for healthcare industries. From the Office of Quality and Patient Safety at the Joint Commission. And so this was even prior to 2022, and now it's emphasized even more. Another thing, and I think Jake alluded to this, and I think it's important to touch on it. Sometimes traditionally, when there was an interest in the industry, we were focusing on the emergency room or the emergency department. And we know that violence in general permeates an entire organization, not just healthcare, but with every industry that we deal with. So you need to make sure that folks understand that, and that the statistics aren't skewed because it goes to the ER, but doesn't focus on staff on staff. I know we don't like to talk about that. Patient on staff, visitor on staff, family member on staff, all these sorts of things that you don't always see. So multidisciplinary threat management teams, in one sense, in healthcare, aren't a whole lot different, but their mandate can be a little bit different for lots of different reasons. So when we say multidisciplinary in a healthcare environment, we've always meant it, but we're talking about every aspect of the organization needs to be represented, and at least in some way, shape, or form. If you put together a program, as an example, and you don't include the nursing corps, that's a huge gap. I know the issue of having physicians being involved due to their schedules and other things, but they need to be represented because all of these things should be taken into account. I think it was Randy that said this is an information-driven system. And so that means if we don't get information, we're not having the opportunity to come up with what we call the proper intervention strategies. So what the commission talks about, representatives from security, human resources, legal, risk. And again, risk is a really important piece of the healthcare industry. Sometimes it is in other disciplines, but healthcare plays a huge role. The frontline supervisors with the highest risk and mental health professionals. So it's not just a matter of who's your EAP provider. You've got, in some cases, an entire system of folks, of clinicians that have to be factored into that. Also, many times organizations will have patient care or patient responsibility to be somewhat segregated from the rest of the organization. That's great, but they have to be represented as well. And by the way, that means they need to be trained. And so one of the things that we carry forward is it's nice if one or two of you have some behavioral threat assessment training, but it's not as ideal if you have a multidisciplinary force and everybody in that group understands what the role is and what the process. And that's another reason why we include a threat awareness piece in the leaders and the managers and supervisors, because they have to understand, not to the same extent as the team, but certainly. Another phenomena that we're seeing more and more is this concept of having a certified threat manager as part of your threat management team. I'm a certified threat manager. I think most of you know that through the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. But particularly in the healthcare industry, Randy, I'm seeing more and more when new positions open up, either creating them or building on when people move on, they want to see somebody as a certified threat manager. They have that body of knowledge, and that means you're consistently applying some of these. And again, it seems intuitive to us now, but once upon a time, we had a hard time explaining to folks that a multidisciplinary threat assessment or threat management team is a part and parcel of your comprehensive violence prevention program. It's not a separate thing. And so there has to be that connectivity. And they're managing targeted threats in the healthcare setting. Another situation is multidisciplinary threat management teams in healthcare will sometimes deal with reactionary violence too. Lower level violence, it's not planned. Maybe they're not in the pathway of violence, but people still get hurt, and there's trauma that comes with that. So they generally speaking have a larger mandate. So I would like to say that it is prevalent throughout the healthcare industry, but it is not. It's gained great ground in the last 10 or 15 years since I've been actively doing this with the center. But it needs to continue to be, and we're very hopeful compliments of these compliance documents that Jake was kind enough to go through, that not only is it a nice idea, you need to do it. And here's the key, it's effective. These things work. You won't be able to catch them all, okay? But we'll be able to mitigate many, we'll be able to avoid some tragedies. And the healthcare industry has got its own portfolio over the last 20 years of acts of extreme violence. And we don't have time for that today, but rest assured, it's not a unicorn in this discipline.
So,
Dave, one question for this space. When we get up to this level of threat, behavioral threat assessment and management, a lot of healthcare organizations have emergency response teams or, behavioral emergency response teams. Can you talk a little bit about like the difference between that team and a threat management team or a threat assessment team?
Sure, be happy to. So first and foremost, what you call these things is very organizational specific. I've long since gotten over the idea that, threat assessment is a process, it's a thing. That's what I teach when we train. Threat management is programmatic, but many of you call them, behavioral threat assessment groups, threat management groups, critical incident response teams, but almost always you also have a component that's more response oriented. What's going to happen when you have an event like this? The multidisciplinary threat management group, some of the same people may be members of that CERT team or whatever it's called, but they're processing the likelihood of violence and what intervention strategies, where some of these other groups are much more proactive in getting out there. So that means they have to work very closely together. So thanks for asking that question. And that's becoming more and more best practice in the healthcare community.
Yeah, I think when I try to think of the threat management process, what comes to mind, the word that comes to mind for me is proactive. Would you agree, Dave, where it's really emphasizing that prevention process, getting in front of these, when a report is made under the policy, it's getting in front of that issue and trying to deal with it on a real-time basis rather than when an incident or an after action report is submitted and having a meeting when it's all said and done. That threat management team is really dedicated to when these things are happening in a real-time basis. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct, Jake. And that's why Randy was so correct when he emphasized, what to report, who to report to, how to report it, and when. And that really needs to be re-emphasized through that process, because if the threat management team or whatever you may call them within your organization doesn't get that information, the clock is ticking. And so the earlier we get the information, and because we're in a healthcare setting, do we have privacy concerns? You bet. Do we have confidentiality concerns? You bet. But you know what? We have the people within that multidisciplinary group that can deal with that. So there should be no excuse for expeditious handling of these types of cases. So that's exactly right.
Awesome. Thank you. And so you can see, folks, how this really all layers together. At the baseline, you've got the policies and the plans that really formalize a stance and a commitment to safety and security from a violence prevention and intervention perspective. The training really helps educate people of how to be advocates of the program and report concerning behavior and get that to the places that it needs to go. And then, Randy, that final capstone to all of this is that leadership piece. The senior leadership, the board of directors, maybe for the hospitals and healthcare systems. So how do we want to really engage them, and what kind of things can we look to from them, and what kind of commitment do we need from them in this program?
Yeah, well, with any solid program within an organization, it rises and falls on leadership, as John Maxwell says, and so you want to make sure that your executive team within the organization, your board of directors. And in fact, one of the shifts I'm seeing happen is not only do they need to know, more and more they're wanting to know. They're looking at the news, they see the incidents happening. And so they're going down to the HR security department saying, hey, what are we doing in this area? How are we protecting our employees from these type of violence incidents? And do we have quote unquote active shooter training? Well, yeah, we do have active shooter training, but not just active shooter training. We have a whole package. We have a holistic approach focused on prevention. And then what do we do with the active shooter? So that's part of what they need to understand is what's included in the program. They also need to understand what's the liability exposure of not having a program and not having a complete program. So having those understanding of what those policy and governance documents that Jake talked about at the beginning of this webinar, and what is required because it's not just money, it's also time. And, when we're implementing these kind of programs, it takes resources. So having the top-down buy-in makes it a lot easier to get the program, first of all, bought into by the whole organization, and then working together. And when it's approached appropriately, it sounds just like common sense. And the people they see that whole architecture, the whole pyramid, the leaders of the organization goes, oh, that makes sense. I get that. It's not just an active shooter video. This looks like a solid approach, and I understand we could still have an incident, but we've done what we can, and we've done our due diligence, and more importantly, we are trying to the very best we can to protect our folks and the people that come into our environment. And so that's what you would cover with the leadership is, what does the program look like? Why are we doing this? What's a liability exposure of not having it? And then how do we do it effectively? And then once you have that from the top down, the whole program just seems to run more efficiently and smoothly.
Awesome. Thank you. So that's the tiered approach, folks. Going through that process really covers a lot of those benchmarks, whether it is from the Joint Commission, the DNV, the different accreditation bodies, or aligning with the ANSI standard. Going through this process really allows your system or your hospital to really cover the guidance for all of these different things, and having a process to really to comprehensively prevent, intervene, and respond to violence. And then, of course, we didn't talk about it much in this webinar, but a really large aspect of this as well is the recovery piece. If there is an incident, those actions that are in place to get back to normal operations, and considering the mental health considerations and all of those other pieces. But this is that tiered approach. And one of the things that, as all of these progressions in the industry have happened, I'm going to share my screen again here, that we wanted to share with everybody, is we have been working diligently in the background to help promote programs and provide programs for you, our clients, and folks in the industry that have training processes to align with these standards, but also provide something that is valuable for people to receive the education they need to be able to prevent and respond to violence within their day-to-day workplaces. And so you got a couple screenshots there on the left-hand side, but in media-based e-learning products, we've got these available to be able to put on a learning management system, for example, to get that awareness training out there, training specific for managerial personnel. And we even have threat management e-learning courseware available. Of course, all of these things we can do live and those things as well. But sometimes in a day and age when we're so strapped for time and need that self-paced option, or something that can be mass distributed because people are just on the go constantly, there's a process that we have and developed ahead of time for you to be able to implement and have a training regimen to be able to fulfill these different things. And the other thing that we have available too is, this can be a pretty robust and complex process. And so one of the things that we do with our clients at the center is we have the Safe Workplace certification. We're going through this process. We work with you as an external partner to walk through all of these different requirements of the guidance and help you get in alignment with them. And doing that process as a third party, we issue the Safe Workplace certification so that you can have a way to demonstrate, for example, that you're consistent with the Joint Commission standards, that you're consistent with OSHA, that you're consistent with ANSI, the asis document, and having a way to show that you are in alignment with all of these different things throughout your entire program. And so we have those available. And the other thing that we wanted to share with you all is that as part of coming to this webinar live, one of you from our challenge that we did at IAHSS and the things we've done on LinkedIn that you might have seen, is one of you will be a winner to a free registration for our threat management team e-learning course. And so look forward to our newsletter tomorrow, where we will be sending that information out and where we'll be announcing the winner. And of course, if you do win, we'll be in contact with you directly to get you that information. So that's the process, folks, but we have a few minutes here. We always try to leave an open window at the end to talk through some questions and answer any of those specific things. Yeah, go ahead, Randy.
Just to close it down before we take a question or two, is
Yeah.
I just want to highlight, not only is that safe workplace certification a logical flow that brings things into compliance and a third-party validation, you're into compliance with these standards, but leaders love it. Talking about the executives or the board of directors, because it is a third-party validation and it makes sense. It's an easy way for the security department or the HR department to explain the program to the leaders. And I've seen it happen time and time again over the last couple of years, that when you have this framework and you're able to articulate it, and here's the end result of what we get by going through this process, they go, all right, I understand that. That makes total sense. And it makes it easier to get buy-in for whoever the program manager is to have that framework. So if I were to make one recommendation to folks who are trying to build out a program, then I would use that as the end state goal, because it makes sense to the executives when you're talking to them.
Awesome. Thanks, Randy. So with that, folks, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot those into the Q&A, and we'll close out the webinar here. So one of the questions we have from clients, and one of the things that we had pre-written down to kind of address during this webinar, is the dynamic of visitors and patients, and the challenge that we can really bring in having the program effectively address those risks within a violence prevention program. So can you guys just speak to that a little bit in terms of how we've done that in the past, and different things that a healthcare organization can do to really have those considerations of visitors and patients and different people, not just within not the employees and staff, but really addressing those external parties within the program?
Go ahead, Dave.
Sure. So one of the things, and I was really pleased to see it was highlighted in the updated Joint Commission guidelines, is that you need to reach out to all your potential constituents. And so if you're going to do an assessment, if you're going to do a survey, if you want your program to be comprehensive, you have to consider all facets. And sometimes that's doing surveys or exit surveys. Sometimes that's just gathering statistics from different departments and divisions. And that's how you're going to know where your trends are. And based upon your trends is when you're going to be able to formulate, and kind of, given the overarching guidelines here, you're going to be able to specifically hone in and develop your programs. And because some of you belong to very large systems, you have several campuses. Each campus is a little different. And so this is not a situation where you have something at the 40,000 foot level and you're done. It's now we have to take it down to the local level, have your folks, after they have the initial training, to do a walk, what we call a slow walk through the facilities, and make them local. Particularly, we were talking also about active assailant exercises, but across the board. It's particularly because of the myriad systems in place within healthcare. That's the best way to do that, and then keep track of it and revisit it periodically.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Anything from your side, Randy?
No, I think that was great.
Awesome. The other question that I had on here is, when we're talking about how do I want to frame it? It's when we're talking about building this program, how can we really address this from a documentation standpoint, a record keeping process? Because there's a lot of challenges sometimes with getting the information to where it needs to go, and be able to have an adequate, Dave, you mentioned, I think earlier on, the issue of getting enough reporting to really understand how much of this is actually occurring within a hospital, for example. So how can that really be addressed within the program to make sure that we're getting the data that we need to be able to make changes in the future, and have an adequate view of how effective the program is, for example? What does that process look like?
Yeah, and it's kind of a continuation of what I've said previously, and that is you don't know what you don't know organizationally. And so you can tell me when we come in and we do an assessment, I've had this happen more than once. We are the training arm of this organization. And then we partner with you for training and we find out that there's another group that's responsible for this as well that may or may not be sharing that information. Same thing with the investigative role. The investigative role doesn't always, it's been my experience, fall within loss prevention or the security side of healthcare. There are other types of inquiries that are done. So you have to determine who's doing what out there and then ensure that you're getting the appropriate information back in. It's not doing anybody any good to have 3 different, for example, helplines or compliance lines that are answered by 3 different parties and nobody's talking to each other. And so that is not uncommon, particularly for large systems. And you really want to make sure that you're getting the information you need and know who all the players are.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, with that, I think we can close it down here. Randy, any final remarks as we conclude our session?
No, I appreciate everybody taking the time to visit with us. We see the need growing so much in the healthcare industry. I think Dave highlighted it right at the beginning that, we created 2 videos for healthcare about 10 years ago called Flashpoint for Healthcare that was all about prevention, and then Shots Fired for Healthcare that was about the response side. Well, we've gone back to the filming here just the last few weeks and filmed a new level of that tier 2 awareness training for healthcare, the manager, supervisor, and de-escalation examples. So, if you're building out that program, I'd recommend taking a look at those because I'm real happy with how they're turning out and the partnership we've done to create those programs. And they're going to be hot off the presses here in the next week or 2.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, with that, everybody, we will close it down here. Thank you so much for joining. We hope you got some valuable nuggets out of this. Of course, we're always available if you have follow-on questions. We'd love to be able to support you any way that you need it. So feel free to go to our website and contact us. Of course, we're on LinkedIn and everything else. Thank you for joining and have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.